welcome all the participants to this AMA webinar. I am sure you all had a happy Diwali and happy New Year to all of you. These are challenging times, but as Radhika said, AMA is always up to the challenge. And we are also happy that in the new year, we are starting with a very, very appropriate webinar. And we have a very esteemed speaker to deal with the very important subject. This webinar is under the Ramanbhai Patel AMA Center for Excellence in Education. As you know, Ahmedabad Management Association has several such kind of centers which are devoted to the diverse topics and management domains. This particular center, we have been trying to see that we deal with the various important aspects of the education. The webinar title is itself is a very clear, the future of higher education in India, and it is with reference to the new education policy. As we all know, sometimes back, Government of India for the first time after so many years came out with a new education policy. It was a much needed policy, and it is those who have seen the policy, those who have studied the policy at least to some extent, know that it is a very comprehensive and very apt policy. I am also associated, I am a professional, but I am also associated with a few reputed higher education institutions at the postgraduate level. And that is why I also can understand the importance of higher education in India and of course, relevance of the new education policy. We have great pleasure to have Professor K.C.R. Raja, a very prominent name in the field of education academics, not in India, but outside also. And it's my pleasant duty to introduce him in a formal manner. Professor K.C.R. Raja is a mentor and management educator. That is the sum and substance of his profile. Of course, he is the founder director of GIDC Raju Shroff Roffel Institute of Management Studies, which is located at Vapi, a premier institute. But let me tell you, the Professor K.C.R. Raja has been involved in so many reputed, prominent management institutions all over the India. Just to tell you, he is a former director of SP Jain Institute of Management. He was also the founder director of University of Mumbai's Garware Institute of Career Education and Development, as also Somaya Institute of Management. Just now, as I mentioned, he later founded the GIDC Institute of Management Studies, started by the Rotary Trust of Vapi in collaboration with the Gujarat Industrial Development Corporation. He has been in education management for over 3 decades, almost 35 years. He was on the governing bodies of the reputed Jamnalal Bajaj Institute of Management Studies and Research, Institute of Distance Education of the University of Mumbai, Garwar Institute, and the, as we said, GIDC Institute. He has been invited to give as a speaker all over the world, particularly on education management. And Professor K.C.R. Raja has been a mentored faculty and head of institutions in several institutions. And this is, of course, a brief profile. Okay, brief profile of K.C.R. Raja. There are many more landmarks and milestones to his career. But so we are fortunate that we have Professor K.C.R. Raja to talk about a very, very important subject of the future of higher education in India. It's my pleasure, it's a pleasure of Ahmedabad Management Association and my own personal pleasure to welcome Professor K.C.R. Raja. Sir, you can take over. The podium is yours. And as AMA Radhika said, we will try to have about last 10 minutes or so for some interaction with the participant. Professor Raja, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Buch. Many thanks indeed. It's a pleasure for me to be able to come back to AMA after a gap of a few years and to be with you all and also to participate in what I hope would be a discussion on the future of higher education in India. I know that this subject has been discussed at several forums in the last few weeks or months, and several views have been expressed. My own objective today would be not to present the NEP. I'll call it NEP for short, National Education Policy. And not to summarize it, but to give some highlights in the context of what's been happening in the country, what has been the impact of COVID, and of the technological developments which are poised to take place and which will drive the future of higher education in India. I would like to start by warning you that I am basing all my comments on a few assumptions. And one of the assumptions, one of the most important assumptions that I'm making, which has also been stated in the policy document itself, is that the recommendations of NEP, which are very radical in nature, which would lead to a great amount of fundamental structural change, these recommendations would be implemented. I'm sure they will be implemented because steps are already being taken to implement them in terms of legislative action and in terms of administrative work. So ultimately, the impact that it will have and the transformational change that it seeks to bring about will depend on the quality of implementation. So I'm assuming that the quality of implementation will be what we all desire it to be. Second, we don't know how long the COVID crisis or the impact of COVID will last or linger. But I'm assuming that at least in about a year's time, we will be coming to a new normal state. I'm also taking, for the purpose of this presentation, a time frame of about 10 years. And I'm looking at what is likely to happen during those 10 years, although the new education policy takes a much bigger, a much longer time frame. They're talking about what would happen in 2050 and so on. But I'm taking a smaller time frame. Now, there have been educational policies, policy documents in the past. We have had it in the 1960s. We had the famous Kothari report. We have had it in 1984, which was, I thought, a very, very good document. But this document, today's document, is so different and so implementable that it would, in my view, bring about a radical transformation of the structure of education in this country. And this document, unlike the others, comes at an era which is totally different, the internet era, the era when we are actually entering the fourth industrial revolution. I have already entered the fourth industrial revolution. Therefore, I would look at the educational landscape in the country with, if you would permit me, with a few basic facts about education. I'm just trying to. I just want to present these facts. If you look at, and these are all taken from the UGC portal and MHRD statistics.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, but there is some song in the background. I think your phone or something is ringing. Yeah.
No.
Yeah, now it is silent, sir.
Is it okay? Yeah. So we have, if you take all the universities in India, the state university, which is about 450 or so, the private universities, about 220, and the deemed universities, And then there are the institutions of national eminence and central universities, altogether about 75. And the institutions of national eminence include IIMs, IITs, Indian Institute of Science, and so on. So if you take all that, you have total 958 institutions today, as of October 2020. We have about 40,000 colleges, and we have another 15,000 standalone institutions which offer diploma courses, teacher training institutions, and so on, but postgraduate. And we have 35 million students enrolled in these institutions, of which about 31.5 are in the regular mode and about 3.5 in the online mode. And the gross enrollment ratio is 25%, which means that the gross enrollment ratio at the time a child starts schooling is today around 99%. But when it comes down to the 10th standard and 11th standard, 10th standard comes down to about 50%. But when it comes to college, out of 100 children who go to school, only 25 finally land up in a college. So the gross enrollment ratio is 25%. Now, in terms of the students who go abroad, or I'll come to these statistics a little later. The problem that the National the Education Commission had tried to grapple with was twofold, obviously twofold. One, the problem of quality. How do we take a quantum jump in quality? And the other, the problem of reach, of widening the reach, of making education more accessible, more equitable, more affordable. Now, we believe, and not only we, but we've been told by the world organizations and by the others who do independent studies, that we will very soon, maybe by 2030 or even earlier, we will be the third largest economic power in the country. Will this be backed by a dominant role that we will have, that we can have in the educational field? If you're going to be the third largest biggest economic power, will we have a similar presence in the global educational landscape? Look at the rankings, the international rankings of universities, which are done every year. The Times Higher Education does one, which is internationally accepted. There is another body called QS, which does. No Indian institution, not a single Indian institution, figures in the top 100 institutions in the world. Not a single one. Not for academic reputation, not for student perceptions, not for research, not for citations, not for contribution to industry, innovations, and so on. The nearest is in the first 200. The first rank you have is not a traditional university, but IIT Bombay, 152. IIT Delhi, 182. And IISc, Indian Institute of Science, 184. These are the only 3 institutions that I could find in the first 200. Now, if you go to the Times Higher Education, of course, the methodology is slightly different. It is even more depressing. So this is not to damn our universities. We are all the products of these universities. We have been associated with these universities as students, as teachers, as alumni, in various capacities. So we are proud of them, and we would like to see these universities come up in the global arena as with as important, as strong a presence as the universities in UK, in the US, in Germany, in China, in other countries have. So this is the problem, one of the main problem that the educational planners, the NEP, was trying to address itself. Now, one of the problems that they say we are facing, and this is obvious, look at the main universities, the big universities. Bombay University has 700 colleges affiliated to it. Pune University has 811 colleges. Osmania University, 900 colleges. Nagpur University, 800 colleges. If you have more than 100 colleges or more than 150 colleges affiliated to the university, the university finds very little time for any kind of productive developmental work. I have seen vice chancellors spending their time the whole day in meetings. Half the day goes in meetings, presiding over some meeting or the other. Half the day goes in meeting some principal or the other. And then, in addition to that, he's got to worry about examination problems, a whole lot of administrative work. And then he carries all his files home to go through them. And how would you expect the leadership of an educational institution to think in terms of developmental work? What developmental work goes on today in these universities is in spite of the pressures that they are facing. And therefore, this is one of the big problems. The affiliating university, the concept of affiliating university itself. The other is sorry, I'll just. In terms of the strength, teaching strength or strength of students, only 20% of the colleges have enrollment of over 20% of enrollment of less than 100. Yeah, can you imagine? If a college has got an enrollment of less than 100 persons and only 4% an enrollment above 3,000, thousands of colleges have any faculty. They, of course, manage with visiting faculty. And we have a system. These are not my words. These are the words of the report itself, words in the report. We have a system which allows fake colleges to survive while constraining excellent, innovative institutions. So the problem is also systemic. And these are the sort of issues which they try to grapple with when they talk about quality. And what is it that they are suggesting? Yes, another thing that this is a straight quotation from the report, which says India also has some of the toughest requirements in the world for, I'm sorry, I can't, for setting up higher education institutions. These requirements are largely input-centric. If you have made out an application for permission to start an institution, and if you go to AICTE with that application, the requirements which they have laid down, maybe for very good reasons initially, are largely what they call input-centric. How much land do you have? How many computers do you have? How many books do you have? A whole lot of questions, focusing on land, space norms, endowment funds, resources, etc. Such excessive input mandates, together with centralized, outdated, and rigid requirements with respect to faculty qualifications and curriculum implementation, have resulted, I'm reading out the whole paragraph, have resulted in an inspectorial regime instead of an effective regulatory system that promotes innovation and the pursuit of excellence. I thought this was very beautifully put. This is probably one of the very effective and strong critiques of the current education system. Now, what is it that they're suggesting? And as I said, I want to highlight only a few points. And of course, if about 40 minutes are over, I'll stop and make it short, and then we will have a discussion. The most important thing for me, one of the most important things, and that will probably have far-reaching implications, is opening up of the education sector. For a long, long time, we have been protected. Our education system has been protected from foreign competition. In 1991, I remember the late Dr. Prahlad used to come to AMA, and you used to give an annual lecture. I had attended some of those lectures. And he recalled once, he said that in 1991, when Narasimha Rao decided to open up the economy to foreign competition, a lot of our industries, even big industries, started worrying about competition. Dr. Prahlad started in 1993 a global economic forum, which he used to run in Bangalore. And I was just looking up the list the other day. The first of those, I think in 1993, was attended by people like Anand Mahindra, K.V. Kamath, who was heading ICICI at that time, Krishna Kumar, who headed Tata's, Azim Premji, Venu Srinivasan, who headed the TVS group, people of that eminence. And they were attending. And Dr. Prahlad said that the dominant concern, the question that they were asking in that session or in that program was largely this: what does it take us to face effectively competition from abroad? How do we grow if we are to be exposed to the full blast of competition? And they were worried. And he said that 5 years later, in his global CEO forum, many of these same participants were present. And by and large, the question they were asking was, how do we grow faster in the global field? How do we expand our reach as global players? Because they had started buying up companies abroad. They started setting up manufacturing units, buying up mines in Africa or Australia or Latin America, starting factories in UK. In fact, some years ago, Dr. Marshallka was telling us, he was sitting in Cambridge at a dinner in honor of Ratan Tata. And the person sitting next to him said, do you know that this person is the largest employer in manufacturing industry in UK? And India had become the second largest investor in UK at that time. I don't know whether we still have the same position. So we had become global players. Fears about competition were totally unfounded. If we can induce similarly the top 200 universities to set up campuses in India, the view that is being taken by the visionaries, and I call them visionaries, the visionaries who have produced this document, is that we will be able to improve our quality and be able to face competition. It'll be a quantum jump in quality. If you don't, the ones who don't survive, may not survive. Just as it happened to some units in 1991, 92, 93, and so on. But by and large, the Indian educational institutions, its administrators, its policymakers have the resources, have the ingenuity to develop the quality and to take a quantum jump in quality. And this, they say, can be done A, by bringing in foreign competition, B, by focusing on research, C, by totally transforming the teaching learning process, skills building, and accreditation. I think accreditation has come first. Okay. Yeah, so the opening up of the education sector will certainly have an impact on existing institutions. Many of our students, hopefully, who go abroad for studies may not. They will stay on in India. We may even be able to attract international students. Today, about 7.5 lakhs of Indian students go abroad. And it's estimated that about 40,000 crores of rupees are spent. And we get about 40,000 students, about 15,000 students a year, mostly from Bhutan, Nepal, some of the African countries, and so on. If we have the best of universities, our own universities, and foreign universities, let's say Cambridge and Oxford and Harvard and Yale or Stanford, whatever it is, if they come and establish campuses here, student intake will improve. The best students will go there. Some may not survive, but the large majority will improve their competitiveness and will therefore be able to thrive. We will see a totally different educational landscape. Focus on research. Now, one of the things that they are saying is that research is so weak, and this is also brought out in the international rankings. Research is so weak, both basic research and applied research is so weak in this country that that itself is holding back the progress of our education system. Therefore, they are suggesting that we have research-focused universities. I'll come to that a little later. They are talking about 3 types of universities. Research-focused universities, a national research foundation, which will fund research in universities, induce industry to collaborate with educational institutions in applications research that would lead to measurable gains to industry. The other point that they are talking about is accreditation. Today we have a national assessment and accreditation agency based in Bangalore and an NAB, National Board of Accreditation, which is in fact part of AICTE. Now, by and large, they have tried to develop norms, very good, very meaningful norms for accreditation and assessment. But the load on them is so high. See, out of 40,000 colleges, I think even by this year, they would have probably accredited only 15,000 or so. There are institutions, I know of institutions which have been in existence for 20 years and which have not gone in for accreditation. Many have, therefore, we don't really know whether they are making any serious efforts to improve. And quality, and this is not what's been said in the report, but my own association with quality councils and quality assessment, and the lack of it in universities is something which indicates that quality, internal quality audit, which must be a continuous process, must be set up in universities. Today you have the NAAC coming once in every 5 years. It's not a continuous process. And there is no system, there is no mechanism for measuring all this, because what you cannot measure, they say, you cannot manage. And therefore, there are no strict parameters, there are no progress reports, there are no ways of finding out whether in the teaching learning process, whether in terms of research, in terms of student feedback, in terms of student employability, you are making any progress. Now, having said all this, I must also add, I think it would be very unfair if I don't do that, add that this report has been prepared, was prepared before COVID hit us. It was prepared in the pre-COVID era. We know that during the last 6 months, there's been such a disruption of schedules, such a disruption of the entire educational process in this country, whether it's teaching or exams or admissions, and students being forced to learn from home overnight within a matter of 5 days or 6 days. Teachers have been asked to migrate to Zoom and teach online. And this has completely disrupted schedules. This has completely created a situation where the process of conducting classes, the process of connectivity between students and the educational institution has been totally ruptured. And what we see today as online learning is not really online learning, in my view. It is only the traditional classroom which has been pushed to the Zoom platform because we have to do it. And one of the things that the COVID will do is use technology to develop online learning along entirely new lines. Online, of course, it has got convenience. It's got convenience in terms of avoiding commuting, convenience in terms of putting your learning into an asynchronous mode so that you don't really have to have live sessions. You can go back to the recordings. And the teacher also, in that case, gets more time for mentoring. It may also result in lower costs. It may. There are already demands abroad from students for reduction in fees. And they're saying if you are attending only Zoom classes, why do we have to pay the same amount as we would do if we were coming to the college or if we were a residential program? So online learning will take a totally different color. And in terms of delivery, in terms of content management, in terms of the manner in terms of the role of the teacher himself. The teaching learning process, one of the things that has been recommended by the policy is that there should be much greater flexibility in curriculum planning. Today, the teaching that takes place in colleges is by and large driven, understandably, driven by examinations, driven by the compulsions of covering the entire syllabus. And if you look at the teaching load of any of the teachers, it's much more than a teacher should naturally be doing. The teachers themselves, by and large, could be better motivated if they had better opportunities for career progression. And I'm not going into these details. There are many steps which they have recommended, but I'd like to just mention these, that to improve the teaching learning process, they are suggesting that teachers should be trained to use the new technology, and there should be total improvement in the infrastructure, the digital infrastructure, and the physical infrastructure that has to be in place for effective teaching. Skills development. The NEP looks at vocational education or skills development as an integral part of total education, not as a separate stream, but as an integral part. But vocational education being introduced from the school stage, 10th and 11th stage, and brought in, not the way that it's being done now, but a vocational, at least one vocational course being offered. And they are targeting that 50% of the students, 50% of the colleges should be able to offer vocational education. One of the problems we've been having is that we have no national vocational qualification standards. It's only recently, during the last 4 or 5 years, that we have set up a framework for vocational qualification standards along the lines of NVQs in UK, and in collaboration with the industry, because ultimately it is industry that's going to employ these students. Industry has to set the standard. And therefore, to improve employability and to go into newer areas like artificial intelligence, nanotechnology, and so on, which will create a tremendous demand for jobs. Skills development is going to be one of the main focus areas. And I must touch upon this also. When I said the quality of implementation should improve, the assumption again is that the total structure of education will change, and there will be not two bodies which are by and large regulatory bodies today, but regulation will be taken out, and there will be 4 different tasks: regulation, funding, assessment, and standard setting. So there will be a National Education Commission, which will consist of representatives of the state governments, of the central government, education ministry, of state education ministries, because unless you have coordination between the center and the states, the program will not work. The state universities are basically in the domain of the state governments, although they are supposed to be autonomous without any political interference. Then you have 4 verticals, and these are going to be established. AICTE will not be there, it will disappear, but there'll be a National Higher Education Regulatory Council, which will not have the same restrictive powers that the AICTE has today, but it will be something similar to that. A National Accreditation Council, NAC, with expanded powers. You have one NAC today in Bangalore. Now, certification, they are overloaded. They don't have certified examiners. I've seen in many places, the quality councils, quality awards, the Malcolm Baldrige Quality Award in the US, or the National Quality Awards in India, use trained quality assessors. And that's something which will have to be done. We will have to train, not just send any professor without proper orientation or proper training. The parameters should be explained, and some cases should be worked out by them before they actually go and visit the university or the institution. So a National Accreditation Council, and this will be backed by about 200 and odd accreditation bodies in different parts of the country, which will have trained assessors. And then a Higher Education Grants Council, which will have the funding part of the work that the University Grants Commission does today. And then a General Education Council, which will be in charge of setting standards and worrying about the learning outcomes. So this is the setup for governance that is foreseen. And they are projecting, or they're envisioning, three types of institutions in India. Research-based universities, about 150 to 300, with an intake capacity of about 5,000. Teaching universities. Research-based will be focused on research, but also teaching. But teaching universities, 1,000 to 2,000, with a capacity 5,000 to 25,000. Colleges, 5,000 to 10,000, and capacity of 2,000 to 5,000. Now, all colleges, all these institutions will have the power to grant degrees. They will have the power to grant degrees, but only if they are accredited. It's a massive task. It's a massive task of accrediting all these institutions. And those which are not accredited, what would they do? They will not be able to grant degrees. They will not have students coming to them. So all will be accredited, and there will be no affiliating university, which is a great, great change. We have been brought up on the concept of affiliating universities all over India, except perhaps the Delhi University, when it started, was considered a teaching university with only about 4 or 5 colleges affiliated to it. Now, of course, they've got about 60 colleges, but that's the nearest that we came to a teaching university. And there are a couple of central universities. So there will be no affiliated universities. What about standalone institutions? A standalone institution of, let's say, 100 students or 200 students will either be absorbed by a university, be part of a university, or a university campus. Universities can have different campuses in different places. Or it'll just be used for some other purpose, like being an adult education center, or providing some skills-based courses, and so on. So they want to do away with this, and they want to have some kind of consolidation, because consolidation brings in synergy, consolidation brings in pooling of resources, consolidation brings in better and more effective administration. And this is the kind of change that is being foreseen. I would therefore just summarize, and then we will come to a discussion. My own view is that if you take a time frame of 10 years, the kind of change that you will see, and I'm very hopeful about this, I'm optimistic, because after a very, very long time, one finds the government seriously working on it and taking steps to implement these proposals. They're totally committed to it. So first of all, I think the quality movement will hit the universities. The compulsions of the new socio-economic scene, the new educational scene with the entry of foreign universities, with the pressures that are being built on the university, will lead to a quantum jump in quality. And the best of them, the best of our universities, not the biggest, not the oldest, but the best of them will have systems for quality measurement and continuous improvement. And I think this will be reflected in their operations, in their teaching, in research, and also contribution to industry. And those are the parameters which normally matter when it comes to the ranking of a university. And our own students will also go by the ranking. As they grow, the institutions grow, they will look at the rank of the university. They will look at the performance of the industry, of the faculty-student ratio, publications by the faculty, and of the final employability factor, the job placements that it results in. the new model, I think, will be a hybrid one, a mix of online and classroom learning. Today, online learning accounts for just about 5% of the total learning. What is called distance education, yes, does cater to a very large number of students. But the kind of online learning that we will probably see in the new digital age will be very different. The content will have to be different. For instance, just as I have been talking here for 40 minutes, 30 or 40 minutes, I don't think a teacher who is conducting an online class will do, let's say, 1 year from now or 2 years from now, because he will have to, even in the classroom, our own experience is that the normal span of attention of a student is about 20 minutes. So a good teacher at the end of 20 minutes maybe asks a question, tells a story, asks the students to say something, has a discussion, and then he goes to the next segment for another 20 minutes. If that is so, then how much more difficult would it be to capture the attention of the student when you do an online study? The student can switch off his audio or switch off his video. You won't even know whether he's listening. Imagine a situation where you have a family living in a 2-bedroom flat. And I've seen this here. The husband and the wife both work from home. 2 children learn from home. And they all have to share the space that they have. How would you expect a student to study without distraction? Of course, he can go to the recordings. So the teacher's responsibility is all the more difficult. He has the onus of engaging the student meaningfully through short videos, through interviews, through polls, through short exercises, discussions. It has got to be a highly energizing, engaging way of delivering the lecture, which also means that the teacher will have to be helped in terms of knowledge to use the Zoom platform or the educational technology that will be available to him. He should be helped even in content management, because look at, for instance, Coursera. If you do a Coursera course, you know how Coursera delivers it. The way that it is split into segments, and the way each segment is developed. You have short videos of 6 minutes, 7 minutes. You have interviews with very eminent persons recorded. And then you have multiple choice questions after each one of these. And then you get the feedback. And in Coursera, if you do not go back to the course, let's say for 2 weeks, they write to you. So there is constant feedback and constant interaction. So that kind of interaction will naturally have to be there when you have online education, not the kind of online education that we have. And it could well be that this online education would be in many ways ideal for subjects where what's required is a basic transfer of knowledge. Therefore, depending on the course, you may have a mix of 70-30 or 65-40, 65-35, and so on, between face-to-face learning and online learning. Of course, when it comes to skills, when it comes to hands-on learning, if, for instance, in physics, some concepts can be taught online, but if you have to put your hand to something and work in the lab, you can't do it online. And therefore, the work that goes on in skills building will have to be done at the site and not from home. And the mix, therefore, will be maybe more of the lab work, more of the traditional classroom work, and less of the online work. And this could well be, this is an important point. This could well develop into a new learning contract between the student and the teacher, and personalized learning solutions. Case Western University, which I visited some years ago, they had been doing a lot of work on the teaching learning process and on teaching. And they got some very famous persons who have worked on and published books on learning styles and so on. So they were talking in terms of learning contracts. How can we customize learning? Here is an opportunity. Here is an opportunity to customize learning, because not all students need to know all things. And not all students, even for the job they do, need to have even a degree. So a lot of rethinking can be done, and new learning contracts, in my view, can be developed in a way similar to customized solutions being offered in manufacturing, whether it's customized cars or other customized products. Yes, online education, as I said, will be vastly different, content delivery and learning teaching effectiveness. And an integrated approach to skills development is on the cards, because today, both in terms of the employment generation capability of our education system, and in terms of the pressures that it is facing, and in terms of the skills development plans that we now have an opportunity to integrate skills development and to work out skills in terms of specific sectoral needs. We haven't done this. Fortunately, a large number of industries are willing to collaborate. If that is so, then at the regional level, at the local level, one can foresee a mapping of competencies, an understanding of training needs, a survey of manpower needs to start with, and local manpower needs leading to identification of specific job opportunities. From that identification of training needs, and from training needs, working backwards to cover the competencies which are required for specific jobs. And if you get trainers from industry, so much the better. You know, in some countries, in Germany, for instance, it's mandatory for industries to take on students as apprentices. The NEP says we should incentivize industry to take students as apprentices. We should, in fact, not merely incentivize, we should make it mandatory. And we could treat it as part of the CSR activity of the company. So an integrated approach where a national qualifications network within which you have qualifications. In fact, we have 10 levels now. These levels should be nationally recognized, and even in terms of international recognition, there is a lot that we can do. Standalone institutions will either be absorbed by universities or will be used to meet other needs. And hopefully, we will see internationalization of Indian education, and we will see at least some Indian institutions in the next 5 or 6 years, or certainly in the time frame that I have in mind, in the top 100 world-class institutions. So I've tried to not merely summarize the report, but add on my views also. And some of the things that I've said are not in the report should not be, ascribed to them. But this, I think, is a kind of transformation that is likely to happen in the educational scene in India. And it's a great transformation. And these people who have drawn up the report are great visionaries. I do hope that we can look forward to the day when we see a strong global presence of India, not merely as an economic power, but as a power in the field of education. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, sir. Really an enlightening and, of course, very studied presentation with a lot of insights and very relevant also. Radhika, do we have time for a couple of questions?
Yeah, we can, I think it's already 5, I think, but
Yeah.
there are 2-3 questions only, so we can take 1 or 2 questions. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, fine. Thank you. I think we'll go by in chronological order. Mr. Dilip Katdare has
Yes.
said that India needs number of individuals who are ready to enter the business. Is there, with this e-learning facility, is it possible to impart the skills to manage the business?
Yes, I think what can be done and what probably, it's a very, very relevant question. In fact, it's something that I should have talked about. That you see, we have today some attempt at developing entrepreneurship. You have an entrepreneurship development institute in Ahmedabad.
Yeah.
There are IIMs which have got even incubators and which offer, and many of the students come out as entrepreneurs. But we don't need just one EDI. We need entrepreneurial universities. This is not anything new. There are entrepreneurial universities totally devoted to the development of entrepreneurship. And they have seen that in a matter of 4 months, 5 months, the students' mindset can be changed. We need that. And yes, when you come to the question of employability or employment of students, you cannot really expect manufacturing or even the service industries to absorb them. You look at the service industry in India, the large majority are in the informal sector with very low productivity, low tech, which might even be displaced as it's happening in Kerala, which might be displaced by automation and so on. So you need entrepreneurs, and you need entrepreneurs at the local level, regional level, and you need an incubator, you need a national technology, an innovation center, you need some backup in terms of the financing and in terms of idea development, nurturing, and so on, which can be done in an organized way at the regional levels. Yes, entrepreneurship is one of the things that they talk about in the report. An entrepreneurial India, entrepreneurial entrepreneurship development.
Yeah, thank you so much, sir. I think you rightly said EDI. I am also attached with EDI. And of course, innovation, AMA also is going to start a center on innovation, but it requires much more. We'll have a second and last question from Mr. Arvind Shah. He's asking that one university in Zurich, Switzerland is producing so many Nobel Prize winners. I'm not sure whether it's one from one university or not, but what he wants to say is that, is there something possible here? Okay.
Nobel Prize winners are not produced, I think. I don't know whether we produce Nobel Prize winners, but they certainly come up. If you create the right conditions, if you give them the opportunities that they really require.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I think as Radhika says that we have completed the time. What we can do, Radhika, if it is possible, that there are 2 or 3 other suggestions and questions. Can we forward it to Mr. Kesraja? Right?
Yeah, I will just, whatever suggestions and questions are there, I will forward it to sir.
Okay,
maybe
fine.
then he would like to answer them. Yeah,
Okay,
and I will forward it again to the participant.
Yeah, thank you, participants, once again. And Radhika, now you can say final bye-bye. Thank you, Professor Raja. It was for me, it was an enlightening experience, and I'm sure for everybody else also. And we also hope to again be with you again in future with on the AMA forum. Okay, Radhika, over to you now.
Thank you very much, Raja sir, and thank you very much, Padmin Guj sir, for both of you for sparing time.
It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, on behalf of Nair sir, he was conveying the regards to him.
Thank you.
Yeah, and the questions I will mail it to you, and maybe you would like to answer some of them. And participants, thank you very much for sparing time and attending the webinar. Wish you all be safe, and good evening, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, and bye bye, everybody. Take care.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, sir.